Well, good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's go ahead and get started with this week's Third Age Thursday, a time for us to revisit those familiar and sometimes not so familiar stories from the Third Age. Now, last week, to start off Series 2, we got to read some of my favorite comic villains in all of the Legendarium. Okay, they're probably the only genuinely comic villains, I suppose. Good old Bert, Tom, and Bill. Today, we'll pick up where we left off last week with Bilbo trying to catch his breath during a proper fight between the boys. Right in the middle of the fight, up came Balin. The dwarves had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately, and, "A shack, Tom, quick!" they said. Before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening, a sack was over his head, and he was down. "There's more to come yet," said Tom, "or I'm mighty mistook. Lots and none at all it is," said he. "No burra hobbits, but lots of these here dwarves. That's about the shape of it." "I reckon you're right," said Bert, "and we'd best get out of the light." And so they did. With sacks in their hands that they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waited in the shadows. As each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and the spilled jugs and the gnawed mutton, in surprise, pop, went a nasty, smelly sack over his head, and he was down. Soon, Dwalin lay by Balin, and Fili and Kili together, and Dori and Nori and Ori all in a heap, and Owen and Glóin and Bifur and Boffer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire. "That'll teach 'em," said Tom, for Bifur and Bomber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad, as dwarves will when cornered. Thorin came last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief, and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not all well. He stood outside in the shadows some way off and said, "What's all this trouble? Who has been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They had forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with sacks," said he. "Oh, are they?" said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap on him. He caught up a big branch all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in his eye before he could step aside. That put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg, as well as he could. It was thick as a young tree trunk. But he was sent spinning up into the top of some bushes when Tom kicked the sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that, and lost one of the front ones. It made him howl, I can tell you. But just at that moment, William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorin's head and down to his toes. And so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks with 3 angry trolls, and 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, or mince them fine and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly. And Bilbo up in a bush, with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves now and eat them later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument, they had all agreed to it. "No good roasting 'em now. It'd take all night," said a voice. Bert thought it was William's. "Don't start the argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's a-arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert that had spoken. "You are," said Bert. "You're a liar," said William. And so the argument began all over again. In the end, they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a black pot and they took out their knives. "No good boiling 'em. We ain't got no water, and it's a long way to the well and all," said a voice. Bert and William thought it was Tom's. "Shut up," said they, "or we'll never have done. And you can fetch the water yourself if you say any more." "Shut up yourself," said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. "His arguing but you, I'd like to know." "You're a booby," said William. "Booby yourself," said Tom. And so the argument began all over again, and went on hotter than ever, until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them, and boil them next time. "Who shall we sit on first?" said a voice. "Better sit on the last fellow first," said Bert, whose eye had been damaged by Thorin. He thought Tom was talking. Don't talk to yourself, said Tom. But if he wants to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which is he?
The one with the yellow stockings, said Bert.
Nonsense. The one with the grey stockings, said a voice like William's.
I made sure it was yellow, said Bert.
Yellow it was, said William.
And what did you say it was grey for? Said Bert.
I never did. Tom said it. That I never did, said Tom. It was you.
2-1, so shut your mouth, said Bert.
Who are you a-talking to? Said William.
Now stop it, said Tom and Bert together. The night's getting on and dawn comes early. Let's get on with it.
Dawn take you all and be stoned to you, said a voice that sounded like William's, but it wasn't. For just at that moment, the light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood, turned to stone as he stooped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone, unless the birds perch on them. For trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains they are made of and never move again. That is what had happened to Bert and Tom and William. Fun stuff. Now listen, Bert, Tom, and William's dialect, my attempt at doing so irrespective, is definitely used to comic effect here, and it's the kind of linguistic joke that we could expect from Tolkien. But as Douglas A. Anderson explains in his annotated Hobbit, it's also what Tolkien ascribed to Geoffrey Chaucer in a paper that Tolkien presented to the Philological Society in Oxford in 1931. In the paper, Anderson says that Tolkien shows how Chaucer used the northern dialect of Middle English as a source of humor for his southern audience, that's his London audience. Tolkien wrote in his paper that Chaucer deliberately relies on the easy laughter that is roused by dialect in the ignorant or unphilological. But he gives not mere popular ideas of dialect, he gives the genuine thing, even if he is careful to give his audience certain obvious features that they were accustomed to regard as funny. Certainly the same can be said of Tolkien himself here. But Tolkien is even more self-prophetic later in the paper when he writes, "Such elaborate jests are those only of a man interested in language and consciously observant of it." Indeed, Professor. Well, folks, that wraps it up for this week's Third Age Thursday. Now, if there is a bit of the story you'd like me to read and chat about, let me know by emailing barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. For a deeper dive into Tolkien, listen to The Prancing Pony Podcast, my award-winning show with more than 7 years working our way through the legendarium, with almost 6 years in the Third Age alone. Please join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as I welcome a very special guest for Fandom Friday. Please like and subscribe on YouTube, follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.